Hello, and welcome to this series of tutorial videos on creating shaders in Epic Games' Unreal Engine 4. I've got a lot of exciting videos lined up to teach beginners how to create shaders, and my plan is to release a new video each week, so be sure to subscribe. Before we begin this series, it's important to understand the answer to a very simple question. What is a shader? Before we get into that, though, I'd like to take a minute to introduce myself. I'm Ben Cloward, and I've been a technical artist at BioWare since 2007. I started my career in the video game industry back in 1999, making games for the original PlayStation console. And here are a couple of the games that I've worked on over the course of my career. In addition to developing video games, I've also contributed to the community in a couple of ways. I was the co-author of the original Shader Effects plugin for 3ds Max. The plugin was bought by Autodesk and is now the standard method for creating real-time shaders in both Max and Maya. I also created a series of training DVDs to help artists learn to write shaders in HLSL code. Originally, the DVDs sold for about $60 a piece, but they're now available for free on my YouTube channel. So if you want to learn to write shaders in code, be sure to check it out. Alright, let's jump right into it. What is a shader? First of all, shaders are cool. I love writing shaders for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're a way of creating beautiful art with math. So I get to mess around with numbers and logic, and the result is something that looks beautiful. And secondly, most of the things that we work on as technical artists are thankless jobs. So for example, if I created a tool or a rig, the artist would only come and talk to me if something was broken about it. But when I'm writing a shader, people walk by my desk and they're like, "Whoa, that looks great," and I love it. So shaders are code that controls the color of each pixel on the screen, and this code usually runs on the graphics processor. So we do all kinds of things in the code, but the result is a colored pixel. Now when I say code, I don't want you to worry. The shaders that we're going to write in this tutorial series are using the Unreal Editor's material editor, and so we're using a node-based interface to create shaders. We're not actually writing code. The engine's going to write the code for you under the hood based on the nodes that you wire together. Now there is a little bit more to shader writing than just what's here. And to understand that, we need to talk about what shaders used to be versus what they're starting to become now. Currently, game engines use advanced physically based rendering and lighting. And the lighting model is more locked down. It's kind of the realm of the graphics engineers and what the engine is doing for you under the hood. So we, as artists, create shaders that provide the color, the normal, the roughness, and the metallic, the surface properties of the object, and then the game engine does the lighting in itself. Also, most modern game engines have a built-in shader editor, which means you're creating shaders in a node-based interface, like I said, instead of creating code or writing HLSL. And finally, shaders control material properties like color and normal as opposed to lighting. So here are a lot of things that shaders used to be able to do, and I'm going to sort these into two main categories: surface properties and light properties. And you'll see that each of these things falls nicely into one of these two categories. It used to be that when we wrote shaders, we blended these things together, so there might be ambient occlusion or diffuse lighting in our base texture, and we might have a hard-coded reflection map that was specific to our object. But now we're using physically based rendering, and our shaders are providing just the surface properties, and the engine is creating the lighting properties. So it's important when creating our art and when creating our shaders that we're not blending lighting properties and surface properties. The shader is just doing the surface properties, and then the game engine does the lighting properties. So we're going to focus on these things over here in the left column in creating our shaders and let the game engine do the lighting for us. So we're going to be using the Unreal Shader Editor, but the same principles that we're looking at in these tutorials will also apply to other game engines. Um, like, for example, I use the Frostbite game engine at work, and the shader editor that we use, all of the same principles apply there as apply in Unreal. And whatever other game engine you're using, it's very likely that it has a built-in shader editor where you can wire nodes together and do those kinds of things. So for the next part of the video, we're going to jump into the Unreal Material Editor, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of how the user interface works so that you'll be able to hit the ground running when we jump into the next series of tutorial videos. Alright, so here we are in Unreal, and when you first download the game engine, you get it installed, and you open your first project, it's going to create some example content for you, which is what we're looking at here in these folders. And to jump right into the material editor, what you're going to want to do is come into this materials folder. You can see that there's a bunch of materials in here already. We're going to ignore those for now, and we're just going to create a blank one. So I'm going to right click inside this content browser, and it brings up this menu where I can select what kind of a new thing I want to create. And in this case, I'm going to pick a material. So here's my material. It's called New Material, and Unreal seems to follow this naming convention of M underscore for materials, and so I'm going to follow that. I'm going to call this M underscore my new material, and then we're going to double click on this to bring up the material editor, and here it is. So the first thing that I want to do is introduce you to the various parts of the material editor. Over here on the left hand side, we have a preview of what your shader is going to look like when you put it into the game. Right now I have a black sphere here because there is no shader really. There's nothing being applied. But once we start creating a shader, it's going to be applied to this sphere. And you can see that the sphere is resting on a plane, and there's this nice environment map in the background, probably from the Epic Games campus in North Carolina. Alright, so that's our preview, and that will show us what our shader is going to look like. Now, let me just give you a little tour of the features here. So, first of all, we can choose different shapes to apply our shader to. If we're making a tree trunk shader, this cylinder might make more sense than a sphere. You can also create a flat plane and a box, and then we can use this button to specify our own custom model if we want, but I haven't set any up, so I'm not going to use that one for now. I'll just set it back to a sphere. Then up here in the upper left corner of the window, there are a bunch of different settings. So instead of perspective, I could choose top, bottom, left, right, front, or back. I could choose to use something orthographic rather than a perspective view. Right now we're looking at lit view, which means the lighting is applied. But if I just wanted to see what the model would look like with no lighting, I could switch to unlit. Or there are a bunch of other options available here too. Detail lighting, only lighting, reflections, etc. So there's a lot of different options that you can pick for viewing your model. And then there's also this show where I can hide the grid if I want to. So there's a grid there and I've got it hidden. I can also hide the background, and there's also some stats that I can display or not display. So a pretty full functional previewer here for viewing what's applied to my shader. Next, we have this panel down here in the lower left that shows all of the parameters for the node that I currently have selected in this viewport here. This is the main view or window where I edit my shader, and whatever I have selected in this window, its parameters and properties show up over here. Right now I have the main root node selected, and so you can see there are all kinds of different options and settings for how I can change and adjust the way the main root node behaves. Down here at the bottom I have something called stats, and we're going to get into this in another video where we talk about shader optimization. But what this is telling you is once the shader is compiled, how many math instructions are running on the GPU in order to create this shader. So a nothing shader has 87 instructions, and the reason that it takes 87 instructions to do nothing is it's actually using all these instructions for the lighting and I've got a nice specular highlight here and I've got reflections. So this isn't just nothing. There's a lot going on here, and that costs 87 instructions even before you get started on what you're going to do. All right, and then over here on the right hand side, we have a long menu of all of the nodes that are available to stick into your shader. Now this menu isn't something that I use very often, mostly because you can access the exact same thing simply by right-clicking here in this window. So if I right-click, you can see I have access to all of the same node listings as I have over here. And the nice thing about this list is that I don't have to go hunting for it. I can just type what I want. So for example, if I want to lay down a texture map, I can just type the word texture, and here I have my texture sample node, and it comes right up. Alright, well that's a good way to just go ahead and get started. So let's create a very simple texture, or a very simple shader rather, simply by wiring our texture sample into our root node. Let's say we want to apply a texture. So here's our texture sample node, and we come over here to the properties. Now you notice when I pick the texture sample node, what properties show up over here change. When I have the root selected, the root properties are displayed. When I have the texture sample node selected, the properties of that node appear. So if I want to pick a texture, I click on this drop down node, and all of the textures that are available to me show up in this box. Now, just quickly, I want to show you where that comes from. So I'm going to switch back to here. I'm going to minimize this window, and I'm going to switch back to my example content. Right now I'm in materials, but if I go back to starter content, you can see there's another folder called textures. So all of the textures that I've imported or that are available show up here, and these are the same textures that show up in that list for my shader. So I can import new textures by right-clicking and creating a texture here. But I'm not going to do that now. I'm just going to use a texture that I already have. So let's switch back to the material editor. I'm going to drop the box down, and let's see, what do I want to do? Let's pick brick clay new. So now I've loaded a brick texture into my texture sample, and I want to use this texture sample in my shader. And so in order to do that, I'm going to wire the texture sample node into the root node. So I'm just going to left click and drag right here where it says RGB, because I want the RGB color of my texture. I'm going to left click and drag, and I'm going to wire that directly into base color. And when I let go, the shader connects. And right now it's compiling, so you can see it took a minute. It kind of hesitated there, and then it compiled my shader, and you can see that now I have a brick texture applied to my preview model here. And down here in the bottom, you can see my base pass shader instructions are now 90, so it went up from 87 to 90. It took 3 shader instructions to apply my texture to my shader. Okay, let's see what we can do with some other nodes. You can also put down a constant node. Constant node is just a single number. And we're going to get into more detail in this when we have our video on data types. But this is just like a black and white or grayscale value. So if I wire that into my base color, you're going to see that it'll turn black because my value is 0. But if I set this to a value of 1, my shader or my preview model is going to turn white, and I can set it to like a lower number and it'll turn gray. Well, what if we want a color instead of just a grayscale value? If I right click here and type constant again, a color is a constant 3 vector. And the reason it's a 3 vector is because colors need R, G, and B. It needs 3 channels instead of just 1. So I'm going to drop down a constant 3 vector, and you can see here there's a color that shows up. Right now the value is 0, 0, 0. But if I come over here and I click on the color, then I get this nice color picker, and I can pick a shade of blue and hit OK. And this is going to update with my blue, and then I can wire that into my base color, and I'll get a nice shade of blue on my preview model. Now what if I want to disconnect a node? Well, there are a couple of different ways of doing that. I can right click here on this guy and pick break link, or I can also hold down the Alt button on my keyboard and just left click, and that will disconnect the wire. These kinds of standards are different in every material editor. In the Frostbite editor that I use, you can just hit delete. You can select a wire and hit delete. But in Unreal, I can't. I can't select wires. I can just hold down Alt and left click to break them. Okay, so that's some basics. We have our material preview here. We have our properties window. We have our node-based shader editor window here. We have our stats down here. And we have our giant list of shader nodes that are available. So I'd recommend that you just go ahead and start playing around with some of these nodes. It's really important to become familiar with all of the nodes that you have available. So take a look at what some of these do. It's really easy to get documentation on these if you just hold down Control and Alt. It'll give you a nice simple description of what the node does, but then you can click here and it'll take you to a web page with full documentation for each of these nodes. So it's a really good way of just, you can grab nodes, plop them down, and then go and read the documentation to find out what they do. Alright, that's it for this video. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. I have a whole series of tutorial videos planned, and we're going to go over all kinds of really cool stuff in the Unreal Material Editor. So I'll see you in the next video.